There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from pain itself, but from trying to understand it for too long. It settles in quietly after the questions have been asked again and again, after every possible explanation has been turned over and found insufficient. It is the fatigue of someone who is no longer angry, no longer pleading, no longer even desperate for relief, only tired of not knowing what any of it was for. Most people can endure suffering when it feels temporary, when there is at least the promise of meaning waiting on the other side. But when suffering stretches on without interpretation, when the mind keeps circling the same unanswered question, something deeper begins to erode, not hope exactly, but orientation. The sense that life has a shape, a direction, a logic that can be trusted. There are moments when silence becomes heavier than pain, when the absence of explanation feels more unbearable than the loss itself, not because answers would fix everything, but because they would at least confirm that someone was listening, that the chaos had been seen and named. In those moments, people often replay their lives with forensic attention. They search for causes, for errors, for hidden faults that might explain why things unfolded the way they did. They reconstruct conversations, decisions, prayers, compromises. They wonder if suffering is a consequence, a lesson, a warning, or simply a mistake. And when none of these possibilities settle the weight, the questions remain suspended, unanswered, slowly reshaping the person who carries them. This is not rebellion. It is not disbelief. It is the human response to prolonged uncertainty. The instinctive need to place suffering inside a story that makes sense. To believe that pain fits somewhere, that it obeys a rule, that it is not random or wasted. But there comes a point when even the search for meaning begins to feel futile, when the questions lose their urgency and become background noise like a low hum that never stops. At that point, silence no longer feels like a pause before a response. It feels final, intentional, as if whatever explanation might have existed was never meant to be given at all. And it is there, not at the beginning of suffering, but long after, that the deeper question quietly forms, not why this happened, but what remains when no answer comes. When the universe does not explain itself, when the silence holds, there is a moment when even the most patient person begins to realize that waiting itself has changed them, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly over time. The questions they once asked with urgency now surface more slowly. The anger softens into something duller. The hope for explanation becomes less about relief and more about orientation, about knowing where to stand in a world that no longer feels predictable. At first, silence is interpreted as delay, as if the answer exists somewhere and simply has not arrived yet. People tell themselves that clarity will come with time, that perspective will settle things, that endurance will be rewarded with understanding. And so they wait, they endure, they continue speaking into the quiet, believing that persistence itself is meaningful. But prolonged silence does something subtle. It begins to feel less like postponement and more like absence. Not the absence of care, necessarily, but the absence of explanation. The unsettling possibility that the story will move forward without resolving the questions that shaped it. That life might continue without ever clarifying why certain things were allowed to happen. This is often when people begin to measure themselves. They wonder if they have earned the right to an answer, if they have suffered enough, been faithful enough, spoken honestly enough. They replay their own words, searching for mistakes in tone or posture, as though the silence might be conditional, waiting for the correct approach. Yet the longer the silence lasts, the clearer it becomes that this is not a negotiation. The quiet does not respond to refinement. It does not react to better arguments or deeper sincerity. It simply remains. And that realization can feel destabilizing, because much of human endurance is built on the belief that meaning is eventually revealed, that explanations arrive, even if late. When that belief begins to crack, the struggle shifts. It is no longer about surviving the pain, but about surviving without the reassurance that the pain will ever be explained. At that point, silence stops being empty. It becomes a presence of its own, something that presses inward, forcing a different kind of reckoning, not with answers, but with limits. With the realization that some parts of existence may never be narrated in a way that satisfies the one living through them. And it is precisely here, in this unsettled space between waiting and knowing, that the human heart begins to sense that something deeper is being asked of it, even if it cannot yet name what that is. Eventually, silence stops being interpreted as something that needs to be solved. It becomes something that must be faced. Not argued with, not filled, not explained away. Faced. Because by this point, most of the obvious explanations have already been exhausted. The mind has done its work. The heart has said what it needed to say. What remains is not confusion, but a quiet awareness that something deeper is unfolding, whether one understands it or not. This is often when people begin to sense that their struggle is no longer only about what happened, but about where they stand now, about the limits of their own understanding, about the uncomfortable truth that not every experience will be translated into meaning on demand, that some moments resist interpretation, no matter how sincerely they are approached. It is in this space that many discover how much of their inner stability depended on answers they never realized they were leaning on. Explanations had functioned as anchors. They provided orientation, a way to locate oneself in the story of one's own life. When those anchors are removed, there is a strange weightlessness, not freedom, but exposure. The feeling of standing without reference points, without the reassurance that the ground beneath will behave predictably. And yet, even here, something continues. Breath continues. Days continue. The body adapts to the absence of clarity in ways the mind cannot fully articulate. Habits form. Movements repeat. Life does not stop to wait for understanding. It moves forward, quietly insisting that existence itself is not conditional on explanation. This is where the story of Job begins to feel uncomfortably close. Not as a lesson, but as a mirror. Job has spoken. He has protested. He has demanded answers with integrity and exhaustion. And then for a long stretch, nothing happens. No correction, no reassurance, no explanation that ties the suffering into a neat moral arc. The silence in Job's story is not brief. It is long enough to strip away illusions about control. Long enough to reveal that the desire for explanation can sometimes mask a deeper fear. The fear that without answers, life might lose its coherence entirely. And yet, the story does not collapse into despair. It pauses. It holds. As if waiting for the moment when words will finally return, not to explain what happened, but to reframe what it means to exist in a world where not everything is clarified. The longer silence lasts, the more it begins to rearrange expectations, not dramatically, but quietly. People stop anticipating answers and start adjusting their lives around the absence of them. What once felt temporary slowly takes on the shape of permanence, and this is often the most disorienting realization of all, not that suffering happened, but that it may never be explained in the way one hoped. This is where many stories break, because endurance is usually fueled by the belief that something is coming, some clarification, some resolution, some moment where the weight is finally placed into a frame that makes sense. When that moment fails to arrive, the question is no longer how much one can endure, but whether endurance itself still has meaning. It is here that the ancient text begins to surface, not as instruction, but as presence. Job has already spoken at length. He has defended himself. He has questioned the logic of what unfolded. He has reached the end of argument. And then, after the silence has done its full work, something unexpected happens. Not comfort, not explanation, not justification. God speaks, but not in the direction Job demanded. The voice that enters the story does not answer the question of suffering. It does not trace cause and effect. It does not explain why the righteous suffer or why justice seems delayed. Instead, it reframes the entire field in which those questions were asked. It shifts attention away from explanation and toward scale, toward complexity, toward a reality far larger than personal narrative. This moment is deeply unsettling because it suggests that meaning may not always come in the form of answers, that the universe does not owe coherence to individual pain, that understanding everything was never promised, even to those who suffer honestly and speak truthfully. And yet, the presence itself matters. The silence is broken, not to resolve the tension, but to deepen it. To move the struggle from the level of fairness to the level of existence itself. As if the question is no longer why did this happen, but what does it mean to live in a world that cannot be fully explained and still remain? At some point, silence stops being interpreted as absence and begins to feel like a condition of reality itself. Not something imposed temporarily, but something built into the structure of existence. This is when the struggle changes shape again, because the question is no longer whether an answer will come, but whether life can still be lived honestly without one. This realization often carries an unexpected weight, not because it is dramatic, but because it is ordinary. People wake up, they work, they eat, they speak to others, and beneath all of it, the unanswered question remains, no longer sharp, but persistent. Not demanding resolution, just refusing to disappear. It becomes part of the rhythm of living. In the story of Job, this is the moment just before everything shifts. Not outwardly, but inwardly, Job has exhausted argument. His friends have exhausted explanation. The human framework for understanding what happened has collapsed under its own weight. And in that collapse, Something else becomes visible, the limits of human language when it tries to contain the scale of reality. What follows is not comfort in the way people usually hope for it. It is not reassurance that everything will make sense later. Instead, it is a confrontation with scale, with complexity, with forces that operate far beyond individual suffering. The world is revealed not as cruel, but as vast. Not as indifferent, but as uncontainable. This is deeply unsettling, because it removes the illusion that life is organized primarily around personal fairness. It suggests that existence does not revolve around explanation, even when pain is real and undeserved. And yet, within that vastness, life continues to invite participation. Breath still enters the lungs, hands still find work to do, the day still moves forward. This is where meaning quietly changes definition. It is no longer something granted through understanding, but something practiced through presence, through continuing to live, to choose, to remain, even when the world does not explain itself, not because the silence has become easier, but because resisting it no longer feels like the point. And it is here, just before any divine voice enters the story, that the deepest tension settles, not in the absence of answers, but in the question of whether a human being can remain fully alive inside a mystery that refuses to resolve. There is a quiet grief hidden inside many stories of faith. Not the grief of loss itself, but the grief of what never arrived. Of prayers that were sincere and unanswered. Of hopes that were carried carefully, sometimes for years, only to be laid down without ceremony. This grief rarely announces itself loudly. It settles into the background of life, shaping expectations, softening certainty, teaching people how not to hope too quickly. The story of Job is often remembered for its endurance, but less for its cost. Job survives, but he does not emerge unchanged. Something has been taken that is never fully restored, not possessions, not health, but the simple belief that righteousness guarantees clarity. That belief dissolves slowly, leaving behind a more fragile, more honest way of existing. This is where many people quietly recognize themselves in the text. Not in Job's suffering alone, but in the realization that faith does not protect from disappointment. That belief does not always lead to outcomes that can be celebrated or explained. Some people do everything right and still carry unanswered questions to the end of their lives. There is a temptation to soften this truth, to rush toward resolution, to point ahead and say that everything will make sense eventually. But Job's story resists that impulse. It allows space for those who waited and did not receive, for those whose faith was real, whose endurance was costly, and whose reward was not clarity, but continuation. This is not a failure of faith. It is its hidden cost, to remain present in a world that does not explain itself, to keep living honestly without demanding that life justify itself first. This kind of faith is quieter, less visible, and often misunderstood. It does not produce dramatic testimony. It produces steadiness. And perhaps this is one of the most uncomfortable truths the text offers, that some lives are shaped not by what they received, but by what they learned to carry. That meaning is not always found in fulfillment, but sometimes in the quiet discipline of remaining, not because answers came, but because walking away would have meant abandoning something even more essential. There is a moment when faith quietly changes its shape, not because someone decides to redefine it, but because the old definition no longer survives contact with reality. What once felt solid becomes insufficient. What once offered certainty begins to feel fragile. And instead of collapsing all at once, belief slowly rearranges itself around what remains possible. For many, this is the most confusing stage, because nothing dramatic happens on the outside. There is no clear break, no declaration, no visible turning point. Life continues with the same routines, the same relationships, the same responsibilities. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. Faith is no longer held with confidence. It is carried with care. In Job's story, this is where the familiar categories stop working. The idea that suffering can always be explained. The assumption that justice will always be visible. The belief that devotion guarantees coherence. These frameworks quietly dissolve, leaving behind a more exposed way of standing before reality. Not weaker, but less protected by answers. What replaces them is not certainty, but attentiveness. A heightened awareness of limits, of scale, of how small individual understanding is when placed inside a world that does not revolve around fairness. This is not resignation, it is adjustment. The posture of someone who no longer demands that life behave according to expectation, but still chooses to remain present within it. This kind of faith does not speak loudly. It does not insist on being admired. It does not offer explanations to others. In fact, it often looks indistinguishable from doubt. But internally, it performs a different kind of work. It teaches restraint. It tempers urgency. It allows mystery to exist without immediately trying to conquer it. This is why redefining faith is rarely celebrated. It comes with loss, with the quiet grief of letting go of what once felt secure, of accepting that some questions will remain unanswered not because they are forbidden, but because they exceed what a human life can reasonably contain. And yet, this redefinition is not empty. It makes room for something else to emerge. Not answers, but endurance. Not clarity, but steadiness. A way of remaining that does not depend on understanding everything first. A way of continuing that is honest about uncertainty, and still willing to stay. There is a quiet moment when people realize that this story is no longer only about Job, not because their suffering is identical, but because the posture he arrives at feels familiar, the slow adjustment, the refusal to simplify, the decision to remain without demanding that life explain itself first. At some point, the distance between text and experience collapses. Most people never articulate this moment out loud. It happens while washing something that has already been washed many times, while repairing what will eventually break again, while continuing conversations that never fully resolve. Faith, at this stage, no longer feels like belief in outcomes. It feels like a way of standing inside repetition without resentment. This is often when people stop asking whether they are doing faith correctly. That question loses relevance. What matters instead is whether they are still able to live honestly, to show up without pretending certainty they no longer possess, to hold responsibility, care, and attention, even when the inner framework that once supported them has changed. Job's experience gives permission for this quieter posture, a way of believing that does not require constant affirmation, that does not need to be proven, that does not demand visible progress. It allows space for days that feel neutral, unresolved, and incomplete without labeling them as failures. There is something deeply human about this shift. It removes the pressure to perform meaning, to turn every experience into growth or every wound into wisdom. Instead, it allows life to be lived at its actual pace, with its uneven rhythms and unfinished questions. Faith becomes less about interpretation and more about presence. This does not make life easier, but it makes it more sustainable, because it acknowledges that many people are not living in dramatic moments of crisis or revelation. They are living in between, in long stretches where nothing is clarified, nothing collapses, and nothing is resolved. Just continued existence. And perhaps this is where the text becomes most companionable, not in its answers, but in its refusal to rush the human experience. It allows the listener to breathe without fixing anything, to recognize themselves without being corrected, to continue quietly without needing to know whether what they are doing will ever be fully understood by anyone. There is something quietly radical about the way this story ends its movement. Not with answers, not with relief, but with space. Space to exist without resolution. Space to continue without clarity. Space to breathe without needing to understand everything that has shaped one's life. This is difficult for many people to accept because it runs against the instinct to close the narrative, to summarize suffering into meaning, to leave with something clearly defined. But Job's experience does not offer that kind of closure. It offers something more restrained, a widening of perspective that does not erase pain, but places it inside a reality far larger than personal explanation. When God finally speaks, the silence is not replaced with answers but with presence, not intimate reassurance but scale, not explanation but orientation. This does not diminish Job's suffering. It does not reframe it as insignificant. Instead, it acknowledges that human understanding was never meant to carry the weight of the entire universe, that some questions are not answered because they cannot be, not because they are ignored, and this realization, while unsettling, carries a strange kind of relief. The relief of no longer having to solve existence in order to live within it. Many people reach this point quietly in their own lives, after years of asking, after exhausting every interpretation, after carrying disappointment without spectacle. They stop demanding coherence from everything that happens to them, not because they no longer care, but because they recognize the limits of what a human life can reasonably hold. This is not surrender in the dramatic sense. It is not giving up. It is a softer form of acceptance, the decision to live without forcing meaning where it refuses to form, to remain present even when understanding fails, to trust that existence itself does not require constant justification in order to be endured. And perhaps this is where the story leaves us intentionally, not with certainty, but with humility, not with explanation, but with proportion. A reminder that being human means living inside mystery, not outside of it. That faith, at its quietest and most honest, may simply be the willingness to remain awake, attentive, and present, even when the questions never fully stop forming. The silence does not disappear, but it no longer stands alone. By the time a voice finally enters the silence, most people have already stopped expecting it. The mind has learned to live without response, the heart has learned to carry its questions more quietly, and the body has learned that tomorrow will come whether meaning arrives or not. So when speech returns in the story of Job, it does not feel like a reward. It feels like interruption, like something vast stepping into a room where someone has been sitting alone for too long. And what makes this moment so unsettling is not only that God speaks, but that the speech does not follow human rules. It does not begin where Job began. It does not answer the questions in the order they were asked. It does not validate the logic of the argument. The first words do not soothe. They reorient. They move the focus away from fairness and toward reality itself, as if the problem was never that Job asked too much, but that he tried to hold the universe in his hands. This is difficult to accept, because most people are not asking for complete understanding. They are asking for one small thing, a reason they can live with, a line they can hold on to, a sentence that allows the suffering to sit inside a frame. But Job 38 does not offer a frame. It offers scale. It offers questions that do not accuse so much as they dismantle the illusion that existence can be reduced to personal explanation. Where were you when the foundations were laid? Have you ever commanded the morning? Do you know the paths that the sea obeys? These words land differently depending on who is listening. For someone defensive, they sound harsh. For someone exhausted, they can sound strangely honest. Not because they solve anything, but because they finally name what silence had been implying all along. You are not large enough to explain everything that happens to you. And still, the presence matters, speech matters. The world is no longer only empty space. The silence is no longer only absence. Something has responded, even if it did not respond the way a human heart wanted. The story does not relieve tension, it shifts it. It moves the struggle from "make this make sense" to "can you remain inside what does not make sense and still stay awake?" This is where some people feel their faith crack, and others feel it become real for the first time. Because what is being offered is not comfort but truth, not clarity but contact, not a reason, but a reminder that the universe is not obligated to be understandable in order to be lived within. And the strangest part is that, for someone who has been alone too long, even that can feel like a kind of mercy. What happens next is not resolution, but recalibration. The questions do not disappear, but they lose their central position. They no longer sit at the center of everything else, demanding to be answered before life can continue. Instead, they move to the edges, still present, still unresolved, but no longer ruling the interior landscape. Something inside Job shifts, not because he finally understands, but because he finally sees how little understanding was ever meant to carry. This is not humiliation. It is humility of a different kind. Not the kind that comes from being corrected, but the kind that comes from recognizing scale. From realizing that existence is larger, older, and more complex than any single life, no matter how honestly that life has suffered. The voice from the whirlwind does not accuse Job of asking questions. It simply exposes how small the frame was that tried to contain the answers. For many people, this moment feels strangely familiar. There are seasons when something vast intrudes into a life that has become too tightly organized around explanation. A loss that cannot be integrated, an experience that refuses to fit the story being told. A truth that does not answer questions, but changes what those questions mean. After that, it becomes harder to insist that life must always justify itself. Job's silence, after God speaks, is telling. Not because he has nothing to say, but because speech is no longer the primary response. The need to argue dissolves, the urgency to defend oneself fades. What remains is attention, presence, a quieter way of existing that no longer depends on winning a case against the universe. This is often misunderstood as defeat, as if stepping back from explanation means surrendering meaning. But something else is happening here. Meaning is not being abandoned. It is being relocated, away from answers and into posture, away from control and into participation, away from certainty and into awareness. At this stage, faith no longer functions as a system that explains reality. It becomes a way of inhabiting it, a willingness to remain inside a world that exceeds comprehension without turning away from it. This is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It shows up in restraint, in silence, in the decision to stop forcing coherence where none is being offered. And so the story continues, not with a conclusion, but with a steadier presence. The questions are still there. The mystery is still intact, but the center has shifted. Life is no longer paused, waiting for explanation. It is moving again, slowly, attentively, without pretending that understanding was ever the point. What becomes clear after the voice recedes is that scale alone does not automatically heal. Realizing how small one is does not instantly remove pain, and recognizing complexity does not magically settle the heart. For some, this moment is stabilizing. For others, it is deeply unsettling, because once the illusion of control is gone, what remains is exposure. And exposure can feel like vulnerability without protection. This is where a subtle temptation appears. The temptation to turn humility into silence for the wrong reasons. To stop speaking not because peace has been found, but because one no longer believes their voice matters. There is a thin line between acceptance and erasure, and it is not always easy to tell which side one is standing on. Job does not disappear after God speaks. He does not dissolve into insignificance. But the risk is there, and the text does not rush to resolve it. The reader is left watching a man who must now learn how to exist without centering himself, without disappearing entirely. This is harder than it sounds, because most people only know two modes: demanding answers or withdrawing completely. Many people recognize this tension in their own lives. After something overwhelming happens, they either keep fighting reality or they retreat from it. They stop naming what hurts. They stop articulating what feels unresolved, not because it is gone, but because they fear it no longer has a place. Silence becomes less a posture of trust and more a shield against disappointment. But the story resists that outcome. Job's humility does not mean passivity. It does not mean that his experience was invalid. It means that his relationship to the universe has changed, not his right to exist within it. This distinction matters, because humility that erases the self is not wisdom. It is harm disguised as reverence. What the chapter begins to suggest, quietly, is that there is a way to remain present without dominating the story, to speak without demanding control, to stay engaged without insisting on explanation. This balance is fragile. It requires attention, it requires honesty, and it requires the courage to believe that being small does not mean being meaningless. For many, this is where the real work begins, not in the confrontation with mystery, but in the long aftermath of learning how to live inside it without shrinking away, how to hold one's place in a world that is vast, without pretending that vastness makes the individual irrelevant, how to remain human even after the universe has refused to be fully explained. After everything that has been unsettled, something surprising begins to appear. Not clarity, not relief, but a different relationship with effort itself. The need to keep explaining, justifying, or defending slowly loosens its grip. What remains is a quieter awareness of limits, not as failure, but as boundary. And within that boundary, something like rest becomes possible, even if nothing has been resolved. This kind of rest is often misunderstood. It is not the rest of answers finally received. It is the rest of someone who has stopped exhausting themselves, trying to carry what was never theirs to carry. The questions are still present, but they are no longer being clenched. They are set down, not because they were solved, but because the weight became unsustainable. For many people, this is the hardest shift of all, because rest can feel irresponsible when life is unresolved. It can feel like abandonment of the struggle, like giving up too soon. There is a quiet guilt that comes with stopping, as if constant effort were proof of sincerity, as if continuing to strain were the only honest response to suffering. But Job's story suggests something else. That rest, at this stage, is not avoidance. It is trust expressed through restraint. It is the decision to stop demanding that one's vigilance hold the universe together, to accept that life continues even when one steps back, even when one sleeps, even when one is not actively trying to understand or fix what happened. This does not mean disengagement. It means learning when to release the tension that no longer serves, to allow the body to pause without interpreting that pause as defeat, to discover that remaining human includes knowing when to stop pushing, when to breathe, when to let the unanswered remain unanswered for a while. Many people only encounter this kind of rest after long resistance, after burnout disguised as devotion, after effort mistaken for faithfulness. When it finally arrives, it does not announce itself dramatically. It feels almost uncomfortable at first, too quiet, too still, as if something important were being neglected. And yet this stillness carries its own kind of honesty. It acknowledges that the world does not collapse when one rests. That existence does not depend on constant struggle. That meaning does not vanish the moment effort pauses. In this way, rest becomes less about escape and more about consent, a willingness to live within limits without turning those limits into shame. Fear does not always arrive in moments of crisis. Sometimes it appears later, when things finally slow down, when the struggle has been released, when the effort has eased, and when there is nothing left to do but remain. It is then that fear quietly asks its most unsettling question. If I am no longer holding everything together, what happens next? This kind of fear is subtle. It does not shout. It does not panic. It settles into the background of ordinary moments, turning stillness into threat and quiet into uncertainty. After rest becomes possible, after humility takes shape, fear wonders whether letting go has gone too far, whether surrender has turned into vulnerability without protection. In the biblical story, this is where the human heart often hesitates, not before the storm, but after it has passed. When the noise is gone and the scale has been revealed, fear shifts its focus. It no longer asks whether survival is possible. It asks whether trust is, whether a world so vast, so uncontrollable, can be inhabited without constant vigilance. Many people recognize this feeling intimately, the fear that arrives when one stops bracing for impact, when life feels quiet enough to notice how exposed one really is. The fear is not of pain returning, but of not being ready if it does, of having released the tension too soon, of having misunderstood what humility and rest were meant to cost. This fear does not undo the work that came before. It tests it. It presses against the newly learned posture, asking whether it can hold under uncertainty, whether trust can exist without guarantees, whether remaining present is still possible when anxiety begins to whisper again. And this is where the story refuses to rush. It does not eliminate fear. It does not scold it away. It allows it to exist as part of the human response to mystery. Fear is not proof that faith failed. It is evidence that the stakes are real, that something meaningful is being risked. What matters here is not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let fear reclaim the center. To notice it without obeying it. To remain where one is, even as anxiety moves through the body. To trust that presence does not require certainty, and that courage can exist quietly, without confidence or control. In this way, fear becomes the next threshold, not a regression, but a question. One that asks whether the posture learned in silence can survive movement, uncertainty, and the return of ordinary worries. Whether trust can remain standing, even when calm is interrupted and the future once again feels unknown. Return rarely happens the way people imagine. It is almost never dramatic. It does not arrive with certainty, confidence, or a clear sense of having learned the right lesson. More often, return begins as a hesitation, a pause in the distance, a moment where someone realizes they are closer than they thought, even though nothing feels settled inside. After fear has moved through, after rest has been tested, what remains is not clarity but a strange pull, not urgency but recognition, the sense that leaving completely would cost more than staying exposed, that even without answers, without strength, without assurance, something still draws the person back toward relationship, toward presence, toward life shared rather than endured alone. In the biblical imagination, return is not framed as correction. It is framed as movement. A slow turning that happens before words, before explanations, before apologies are fully formed. It is not yet repentance in its complete sense. It is simply the refusal to remain distant forever. The choice to step closer, even while unsure of reception. Many people know this moment intimately. The point at which independence no longer feels like freedom, but isolation. When self-protection begins to feel heavier than risk. When pride has already exhausted itself, and withdrawal no longer offers relief. Return begins not because everything is understood, but because separation has reached its limit. This movement does not erase what came before. Fear is still remembered. Silence still echoes. The distance is real, but return does not wait for fear to disappear. It happens alongside it. It is not the absence of anxiety, but the decision not to let anxiety decide everything. What makes this moment fragile is that it carries no guarantees. There is no promise of being received well, no certainty that the distance will be forgotten. Return risks disappointment. It risks vulnerability without protection. And yet, something deeper insists that remaining distant is no longer honest. This is where the chapter begins to lean forward, not toward resolution, but toward encounter, toward the possibility that relationship might exist again, even if it has changed shape. That closeness does not require perfection. That being seen again may cost, but staying unseen costs more. And so the movement continues, not quickly, not confidently, but deliberately, one step closer. Not to reclaim what was lost, but to stand where return becomes possible, not yet embraced, not yet restored, simply no longer walking away. Staying turns out to be harder than returning. Once the distance has been crossed, once proximity has been re-established, there is no longer the clarity that movement provides. Return at least has direction. Staying does not, It is not defined by steps but by duration, by repetition, by the quiet discipline of remaining present after the emotion has faded. This is where many people feel unexpectedly exposed. The act of coming back carries momentum. It feels purposeful, even courageous. But staying requires something different. It demands endurance without drama, attention without novelty, the willingness to exist inside ordinary days that do not feel redemptive or meaningful on their own. In the biblical story, this is the phase that is rarely described in detail. The text does not linger on the long stretch that follows reapproach. And yet, this is where most lives are actually lived, not in moments of departure or return, but in the unremarkable continuity that comes after, days that do not test faith dramatically but quietly ask whether it can persist without reinforcement. Many people struggle here because staying removes the sense of narrative progress. There is no clear arc, no visible movement. The questions do not escalate, but they also do not disappear. Fear may soften, but uncertainty remains. And without the excuse of distance, the individual must now face what life looks like when it is simply ongoing. This can feel anticlimactic, even disappointing. After everything that was endured, one might expect resolution, affirmation, or at least a sense of arrival. Instead, there is repetition, familiarity, the slow accumulation of days that do not announce their significance. And yet, this is precisely where something essential begins to form. Staying teaches a different kind of faith, one that does not depend on intensity, one that does not require constant reassurance. It is practiced in showing up again and again and again, even when nothing feels decisive, even when the emotional charge has passed, even when the silence has returned, not as absence, but as atmosphere. This is not stagnation, it is integration. The gradual weaving of what was learned into ordinary existence. The acceptance that meaning may not arrive as a moment, but as a posture sustained over time. That faith may not always move forward or backward, but sometimes simply holds its place. And perhaps this is the quiet truth that follows return, that what ultimately shapes a life is not the courage to come back once, but the patience to remain long after the moment has passed, to stay when leaving would be easier again, to continue when nothing is pushing or pulling, to live not in resolution, but in presence that does not require explanation. What begins to emerge now is not strength, but reliability, not the kind that impresses, but the kind that holds. After the effort has eased and fear has been faced, staying becomes less about conviction and more about rhythm, about showing up in small, unremarkable ways that do not feel meaningful in the moment, but slowly accumulate into a life that can be trusted. This stage rarely feels spiritual, it feels ordinary. It is marked by consistency rather than insight, by decisions that are not debated anymore, because there is no energy left for debate. One wakes up, attends to what is near, responds to what is asked, and rests when the day ends. There is no revelation attached to this pattern. And yet, it is precisely here that something stabilizes. Many people expect faith to feel alive through intensity, through clarity, emotion, or movement. When those things fade, they assume something has gone wrong. But the text suggests another possibility, that faith matures into something quieter, something that does not announce itself, something that no longer needs to be defended because it is no longer fragile. Job does not speak much at this point. The story does not give him new lines to deliver. Instead, it lets time pass. And in that passing, faith is no longer measured by words, but by endurance. By the ability to remain aligned with reality as it is, not as one wishes it were. This is not resignation, it is coherence. For many, this is the longest stretch, the place where progress is invisible and feedback is absent, where nothing dramatic confirms that staying was the right choice. And yet, this is where trust is tested most honestly. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in the value of presence itself. What sustains people here is not hope in the future, but fidelity to the present, a willingness to inhabit the day without demanding that it justify itself, to live without constantly evaluating whether meaning is increasing or decreasing, to accept that some forms of faith are proven only by time, not by feeling. And slowly, without announcement, something settles. Not certainty, but steadiness. Not answers, but alignment. A sense that even without clarity, life can be lived without fracture. That remaining has begun to feel less like effort and more like habit. That what once required courage now requires only attention. This is not the end of the story, but it is a turning point where faith stops asking to be felt and begins asking to be practiced, quietly, repeatedly, without spectacle. Simply by staying where one is and continuing to live as though presence still matters. What follows does not arrive as an answer, but as a shift in atmosphere. Not something that can be pointed to and named, but something that can be felt over time. The days begin to carry a little less resistance. The weight does not disappear, but it distributes itself differently. Life does not explain itself, yet it feels slightly less opposed to being lived. Over time, it becomes clear that what changed was not the world, but the way one inhabits it. The same uncertainty remains. The same unanswered questions still exist somewhere in the background, but they no longer demand constant attention. They no longer interrupt every moment. They have found their place, not as problems to be solved, but as part of the landscape of being alive. This is not victory. It does not feel like overcoming anything. It feels more like accommodation, like learning how to carry something without it cutting into the hands anymore. The weight has not vanished, but it has been redistributed. Life has adjusted around it, quietly, without ceremony. Dobbs' story does not celebrate this moment. It does not linger on emotional resolution. Instead, it allows space for something subtler to take shape, a steadiness that does not rely on explanation, a calm that is not the absence of disturbance, but the ability to remain present while disturbance exists, the kind of peace that does not need to be named in order to be real. Many people mistake this stage for indifference. From the outside, it can look like detachment, like the fire has gone out, but internally, something else is happening. The struggle has stopped defining identity. Suffering is no longer the primary lens through which everything is filtered. Life is no longer organized around what went wrong. This does not mean that the past is erased. Memory remains sharp. Loss remains real. But the constant negotiation with pain has softened. The questions still surface, but they no longer dominate. They arrive, linger briefly, and then pass, like weather that no longer dictates the entire season. What takes their place is not certainty, but room, space to think about other things, space to notice small details, space to respond to the present moment without dragging the entire history of suffering into it. This space is fragile, easily disrupted, but deeply valuable. It is the first sign that the inner life is no longer entirely occupied by explanation or defense. In this way, the story approaches its quiet end, not with answers offered, but with capacity restored. The capacity to live without constantly revisiting the wound. The capacity to exist without narrating every feeling. The capacity to remain human without needing to make sense of everything that has happened. And perhaps this is the most honest form of healing the text allows. Not resolution, not clarity, not closure, but enough space to continue, enough steadiness to remain, enough quiet to let life speak again, even if it never explains itself. And so the chapter ends without answering the question it raised. There is no explanation offered that justifies what was endured, no final argument that makes the suffering feel necessary or fair. What remains instead is something quieter and more difficult to name, the realization that life continued, and that the person remained within it. Dobbs' story does not finish with certainty, it finishes with presence, with the simple fact that he is still there, still breathing, still inhabiting a world that never fully explained itself. The loss is not erased, the silence is not rewritten, but the relationship with that silence has changed. It no longer demands a verdict, it simply exists. This ending can feel unsettling, especially for those who want meaning to arrive as clarity, but perhaps the text is offering something more honest. That meaning does not always come as understanding. Sometimes it comes as endurance, as the ability to live without the pressure to resolve what cannot be resolved, as the willingness to remain human in a world that stays larger than any single story. For many people, this is where faith finally becomes possible, not as confidence, not as certainty, not as explanation, but as a posture, a way of standing inside uncertainty without collapsing under it, a refusal to walk away from life simply because it refused to answer. Nothing here claims that suffering was good. Nothing suggests that pain was required. The chapter does not sanctify loss. It does not turn silence into wisdom. It simply shows that silence did not have the final word, that absence did not erase relationship, that questions, even unanswered ones, did not prevent life from continuing. And maybe that is enough, not in a triumphant sense, but in a human one, enough to wake up, enough to remain present, enough to notice the world again without demanding that it justify itself, enough to carry what happened without letting it define everything that comes next. The story ends, but life does not. The questions remain, but they no longer own the entire horizon. What is left is not resolution, but room. Room to breathe, room to live, room to continue without pretending to understand. If this chapter spoke to you in a quiet way, take a moment to respond. Support this channel by liking the video and subscribing, so these stories can continue reaching people who feel alone in their suffering. You can leave a comment with a simple symbol, not for others to see, but as a personal act of reflection. And if you know someone who may be carrying more than they can say out loud, consider sharing this message with them. The story is not finished, hope is still available, and meaning can still be found, even here.